Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.52, The French Arrive. It is difficult to state just how much the American Revolution was about to change in 1778. During our last episode, we talked about a battle where Washington and Clinton engaged in an indecisive battle with each other. From the Battle of Monmouth, however, it really feels like very little had changed from what we had seen before. Although arguably more successfully for the Americans, the battle felt little different from what was going on the year before during Brandywine or during 1776 at any one of those meetings between the two armies. Despite things feeling more or less the same heading through June 1778, we know that things were indeed much different than they had ever been. The Americans had secured a powerful European ally in the French. France's entry into the war changed the entire dynamic of the war and necessitated that Great Britain step back and consider their own priorities. Throughout the remainder of 1778, more and more members of Parliament came to realize a truth that, just a few short years before, would have been unthinkable. The American colonies were, most likely, lost. Evidence of this had been apparent since the spring of 1778 when Clinton was ordered to carve off nearly half of his army to protect British interests in the Caribbean. With the French joining the war, the British were suddenly stretched far more thinly, and no longer could they afford to have so many troops locked up in warfare in North America. These differences in the war are going to become apparent shortly, and are going to manifest in a changing strategy in North America. We will begin discussing this subject in short order. However, first, it is necessary to bring our new French allies into the war. Unbeknownst to Clinton as he limped away from the inconclusive Battle of Monmouth, he had very nearly run smack into the French Navy, who was just arriving to join the fray. Mere days after Clinton had managed to get his troops back to the relative safety of New York, the French fleet under the Comte d'Estaing made their first appearance. The fleet that d'Estaing brought with him included some 16 ships manned by some 4,000 troops. D'Estaing was a competent commander who had fought bravely during the 7 Years' War, getting bayoneted multiple times before he was captured by the British. Despite this, d'Estaing was well liked by those who mattered, most importantly by Queen Marie Antoinette, who many years later he would personally defend during her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal in France, a decision which would contribute to him finding his own way to the guillotine in 1794. But I digress. Returning back to 1778, the arrival of the French fleet marked a moment of celebration for the Americans. Although Washington did not necessarily believe that the arrival of the French fleet meant the complete neutralization of the British Navy, that is not to say that the French fleet was not formidable. If Washington did not expect to have total naval supremacy, he did believe that the French Navy was powerful enough to cause the British a headache, and to give him the flexibility to launch two-pronged attacks. For George Washington, New York had become something of his white whale. We are going to see repeatedly over the remaining episodes this season that Washington was always looking towards New York as still being the key to winning the war, despite the war preparing to move to the south. D'Estaing quickly let Washington know that, while New York seemed like a fine target, the channel was too shallow for the French ships. This was not merely D'Estaing blowing Washington off either. French ships generally sat 3 or so feet deeper in the water than their British counterparts. Although this might sound relatively minor, even the British had to proceed with extreme caution getting into New York. Although 3 feet may not sound like that much, it was enough to ensure that the British would continue to safely hold New York. With New York now looking pretty secure for the moment, instead, D'Estaing and Washington turned their focus towards Rhode Island. Newport had been captured by the British back in 1776 and had become the last remaining British holding in New England. Command of the American forces in Rhode Island had been given over to General John Sullivan. Sullivan has not exactly had an easy war to date. Remember that it was Sullivan who marched into Canada back in 1776, full of confidence before getting thoroughly routed and seeing the Americans holding in Canada crumble. A few months later, he got badly outflanked on Long Island, and in the process got himself captured by the British. But despite a very rocky start, he is still hanging around looking for an opportunity to polish off some of that tarnish. Washington, needing a general in Rhode Island, sent Sullivan north in late March. Washington had reinforced Rhode Island for the looming battle, giving Sullivan command over approximately 10,000 troops. Although Sullivan must have enjoyed having such a large force under his command, he was acutely aware that the vast majority of those 10,000 men were just militia, with only a small number of accompanying regulars. As July gave way to August, Washington provided Sullivan with a likely unwanted favor by sending him additional officers to help in the common battle. Specifically, Washington would dispatch Lafayette and the current Quartermaster General, Nathanael Greene. To say that Nathanael Greene detested being the Quartermaster General would be an understatement. He was, by all accounts, good at the job. He was keenly aware of the importance of the post and knew that keeping the army well provisioned was a critical and necessary role. However, Greene was none too thrilled about having to serve in a purely bureaucratic position. Greene, like so many others, wanted to find glory on the battlefield. Yet, instead he found himself fretting over if the army had enough blankets. When it came to Rhode Island, however, there was little Washington could meaningfully do to keep Greene from joining the battle. Greene was a Rhode Islander. His wife, Katie, and their children lived in Coventry, not far from where the British were occupying Newport. For his part, Lafayette made almost as much sense in joining this specific battle as Greene did. Sure, the Marquis was not from Rhode Island. However, it did seem fit that he would be on the ground during the first joint operation between the Americans and their new French allies. Washington likely also assumed that should bumps in the road occur, Lafayette was uniquely talented amongst those in the American army to treat with the new allies. Lafayette, seemingly justifying and supporting Washington's decision, wrote to Sullivan on July 22nd telling him that his friend, the Comte d'Estaing, had offered him the French troops that he had on the ships for the battle. Lafayette also reassured a potentially nervous Sullivan that he was not coming over to take command, but that he was going to be there to serve under Sullivan. Upon arrival, Sullivan would give Greene command over the American right, with Lafayette taking up the left. Unsurprisingly, it was to be Sullivan who was going to lead the charge in the center. While preparing for the battle, Greene would also be reunited with his cousin, Christopher Greene, whom years before he had trained with. Christopher Greene came into camp commanding a unit of free black men from Rhode Island. Rhode Island, having a far more liberal outlook than the other states at the time, publicly offered to purchase slaves who agreed to fight for the American cause, and consequently granted them their freedom in exchange. The plan for the combined Franco-American force was a two-part attack. The British, under the command of Robert Pinault, had his garrison, approximately 3,000 men strong, located on the southwest part of Newport Bay. The plan had been for the Americans under Sullivan to approach from the east, having the army ferry across at Teverton to Aquidneck Island, the island where Newport is located. From there, Sullivan would move south and would attack the British from the northeast. Simultaneously, the French would land their 4,000 troops on Connecticut Island, directly to the west of the British position, while the Navy opened up from the west on the British. With the British garrison softened up, the two armies would move in tandem and trap the British between them. The French and the Americans had selected August 10th for the assault. However, very quickly things began to change. You see, quickly the British recognized what was about to happen, and, unsuccessfully, attempted to position their ships in the strait between Connecticut Island and Newport. This failed when the ships ran aground and ended up being burned by the British. Dismayed, Pinault went ahead and scuttled several transports in the harbor, creating at least an obstacle for d'Estaing to have to deal with. This, however, was always going to be more of a hindrance than anything else. It was not going to be something that would actually stop the French Navy. For the joint American and French forces, their problems would begin the day before the planned attack on August 9th. The first problem came from an opportunistic John Sullivan. Sullivan had discovered that Pinot, fully understanding his problem, had abandoned their outer defenses on Aquidneck Island, consolidating themselves further inland inside Newport itself. This provided Sullivan the opportunity to cross his troops from Teverton unmolested. Sullivan decided that he could not pass up the chance to land his men unopposed, which understandably eliminated one of the more complicated portions of his mission, the landing. The problem was that this decision was never communicated to D'Estaing. When D'Estaing discovered that the Americans had decided to move forward with the plans without even bothering to inform the French of the change, he was not amused. If D'Estaing was already skeptical of the Americans, and even to a point distrusted them, this would be the first of several coming events that would reinforce those concerns. D'Estaing's uneasiness about the Americans aside, in short order, he would have his own problems that he would have to deal with. You see, as the Americans were moving towards Newport, D'Estaing learned that the British naval reinforcements under Vice Admiral John Byron had been spotted. Suddenly, D'Estaing found himself in a position where he was looking at a very real risk of being outgunned by the British Navy. D'Estaing decided that the winds were favorable and that he would rather face this threat out in open seas. So, with that, and without landing those 4,000 Frenchmen across from the British garrison, D'Estaing turned his fleet around and headed out into the open ocean to meet the looming threat. All of this, of course, is going on right before the battle on the 10th, and nobody was really communicating with anybody else. Sullivan, therefore, was left with little more to do than dig in outside of Newport and wait for the French to return, whenever that may be. This is the part of the episode where you are probably expecting me to begin telling you about the battle. The French taking on the British in the open seas, the Americans attempting to trap the British garrison, and everybody trying to outflank everybody else. You all know the story well by now. Well, as it would turn out, nature decided that it felt like interfering. Following 2 days of the French and British Navy maneuvering around each other in a well-choreographed dance before battle, a storm rolled in and rendered all of that maneuvering completely moot. Both fleets were scattered and damaged, and suddenly, keeping the ships upright became far more of a concern than any danger posed by the opposing guns. Meanwhile, Sullivan, who was sitting outside of Newport, biding his time, was busy wondering exactly when D'Estaing planned on coming back. Having grown impatient, Sullivan decided to try his luck on August 14th and proceed without the French. After a brief attempt at attacking the British lines, Sullivan was repelled and settled into establishing a siege of Newport. Following this failed assault, Sullivan was right back where he began, twiddling his thumbs and looking around, wondering exactly where his French allies were. Finally, on August 19th, D'Estaing returned. However, if Sullivan believed that the battle was now about to begin, and the plot to trap the British garrison between the two armies was starting, he was going to be deeply disappointed. Upon his return, D'Estaing had absolutely no intention of fighting anymore. The French Navy had taken serious damage during the storm, and it was now imperative for them to pull back to Boston for repairs. D'Estaing further reported that he had intelligence that another British fleet was moving towards Narragansett Bay, and with his own fleet limping, he had no intention of being there to greet them. Sullivan did what he could to get D'Estaing to change his mind. On August 21st, he sent Greene and Lafayette to try to convince D'Estaing to hang around, if just only for a little while longer. However, following the storm and with the prospect of the approaching British Navy, the decision was made. On August 22nd, D'Estaing pulled out of Narragansett Bay. Adding insult to injury, D'Estaing had absolutely no plans to leave any of those 4,000 French troops behind to help the Americans. We all know by this point about just how poorly the war was going for John Sullivan. If this was his chance to earn some of that glory, that he had heard so much about. He was dismayed as he watched his opportunity preparing to set sail towards Boston. To say that he took it poorly would be an understatement. While it was expected that he would be upset, Sullivan would show a complete lack of diplomatic grace and showed that his political acumen may not have been much better than his military abilities. The exit of the French army was a catastrophe for Sullivan's army. Recall that his army had been made up largely of militia that lacked the discipline of the regulars. As the Americans in Newport watched the French sail away, much of the militia decided that it no longer looked like it was going to be a good time for them. Just like that, half of Sullivan's army just melted away as the militia abandoned in droves. With the situation in Rhode Island now looking increasingly hopeless, Sullivan decided that this was the perfect time to share with D'Estaing just how he was feeling. Not holding anything back, on August 22nd, Sullivan wrote, accusing the French of treachery and cowardice. He made sure to include a line in there, letting D'Estaing know that he had just dishonored France itself. Nathanael Greene, for the second time in as many episodes, agreed to sign the letter, largely out of pressure, despite the fact that he seemingly understood that it was probably a pretty bad idea to be putting his name on that letter. Shaking his head at his American colleagues, it fell to Lafayette to try and smooth things over. Writing on August 22nd, Lafayette assured D'Estaing that he had nothing to do with the letter from Sullivan and Greene, and reassured him that his paramount loyalty was still with the French. He made clear that he viewed the writing as being a mistake, and let D'Estaing know that he had vocally objected to it. In subsequent letters from Lafayette, he would take deliberate efforts to impress on D'Estaing just how happy everybody was to receive him. Nathanael Greene, for his part, quickly realized that he had made some mistakes in putting his name on that letter. He wrote to Lafayette his own apology. Although the actual letter appears to be lost to history, Lafayette mentions Greene's about-face on the matter in a August 25th letter to George Washington, where Lafayette decided to let him know about the concerning letter that Sullivan had produced. Washington, writing back, told Greene that it was on him to fix both this situation and to ensure that Sullivan's comments did not become public. In the letter to Greene, discussing both the French leaving Newport prematurely, as well as the letter from Sullivan, and co-signed by Greene, Washington wrote, "Right or wrong, it will probably disappoint our sanguine expectations of success, and what I esteem a still worse consequence. I fear that it will sow the seeds of dissension and distrust between us and our new allies. Except the most prudent measures are taken to suppress the feuds and jealousies that have already arisen. I depend much upon your temper and influence to conciliate that animosity, which I plainly perceive, by a letter from the Marquis, subsists between the American officers and the French in our service." There were plenty of people in the United States that still held strong anti-French prejudices. Should that letter from Sullivan become public, it would do nothing but reinforce those feelings that Washington, and indeed the entire Congress, desperately needed the American people to get over and put behind them. Washington simply could not afford to have Sullivan's leadership endangering that treaty. Washington was never particularly close with Sullivan, but he was with Greene. It was imperative in his eyes that Greene do whatever necessary to fix any damage caused to the alliance. As Lafayette took to a campaign of damage control, Sullivan decided that the French were not required to retake Newport. However, wisely, after a few days' worth of consideration, Sullivan too picked up on the fact that it was going to be a pretty bad idea to try to retake Newport on his own. As much as he wanted that glory, it was simply not going to come in Rhode Island. So, with that, on August 28th, Sullivan set to the task of pulling back and evacuating the remaining army. Seeing the Americans withdraw spurred the British in Newport to try to gain a victory out of near defeat. On August 29th, a combined British and Hessian force attempted to overrun the retreating Americans. What ensued was a running battle that ended in a draw, with the Americans suffering some 200 losses and the British around 300. the Americans held their position enough to ensure that their withdrawal remained orderly, and that it did not collapse into a free-for-all sprint like we might have expected back at the beginning of the war. The Battle of Newport is interesting for a few reasons. First, and probably most importantly, we need to acknowledge that despite me referring to this as the Battle of Newport, there was never really much in the way of an actual battle, much to the considerable chagrin of General Sullivan. Rather, what emerged during August of 1778 was an aborted mission to try and regain Newport that left a lot of hurt feelings in its wake. So I want to spend the rest of today examining what we can learn from the failed assault on Newport. First, I want to address the battle itself, because I don't want that to get lost in the bigger discussion over Franco-American relations. Although the way things played out were not exactly ideal, Sullivan would have much rather scored a big victory and driven the British from Newport. That does not take away from the fact that the American army did manage a successful and orderly retreat. With the militia having evaporated off following the French withdrawal, it is not hard to imagine a situation where things go from bad to worse, and the Americans find themselves looking at a catastrophic loss, rather than a stinging disappointment from the aborted assault. Much in the same way that the Continental Army had held their own at Monmouth, they had here again proven that they were becoming a far more disciplined fighting force. Really, though, the major takeaway from the Battle of Newport has little to do with winning or losing the battle, but instead it provides us a look at the earliest stages of the new alliance between the United States and France. We have talked before about the fact that, despite its necessity, many Americans were weary of the new partnership. It is not as though everybody was able to suddenly forget that since the 1690s, the colonists had fought 4 different wars against the French. The biggest of those wars by far, the French and Indian War, had occurred within living memory for many. Whereas Greene would quickly see the errors of his ways and write to D'Estaing personally apologizing, an apology that D'Estaing accepted, Sullivan was in no mood for mending bridges. Sullivan, feeling as though the French were solely responsible for his inability to secure a victory in Newport, continued to take shots at D'Estaing. By this point, however, Sullivan was largely on his own in his griping. Everybody else, who may have been taken up in the emotion of the moment, regained their senses and understood just how critical the French alliance was to the prospects of securing permanent American independence. Washington was certainly unhappy by the continued letters from Sullivan, and found himself having to explain the importance of the alliance to one of his top generals, a situation that he must have found very frustrating. On the same day that Washington wrote to Greene that he needed him to fix this, he also wrote to Sullivan. Washington wrote, "The disagreement between the army under your command and the fleet has given me very singular uneasiness. The continent at large is concerned in our cordiality, and it should be kept up by all possible means that are consistent with our honor and policy. First impressions, are generally longest remembered, and will serve to fix in great degree our national character among the French. In our conduct towards them, we should remember that they are a people old in war, very strict in military etiquette, and apt to take fire when others scarcely seemed warmed. Permit me to recommend, in the most particular manner, the cultivation of harmony and good arrangement, and your endeavors to destroy that ill humor which may have gotten into the officers. It is of the greatest importance, also, that the minds of the soldiers and the people should know nothing of the misunderstanding, or if it has reached them, that ways may be used to stop its progress and prevent its effects." Although Sullivan was a particular headache for the Americans due to his position in the army, he was not the only person in the United States who was more than just a little hesitant to trust the French. This uneasy relationship between the French and the Americans would be plainly put on display upon the French fleet reaching Boston. Massachusetts was stretched thin in 1778, although the destruction of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga more or less secured the region for the Americans. As it would turn out, Burgoyne was still causing headaches for the Bostonians. Massachusetts was in the middle of a drought, which had caused significant damage to that year's grain harvest. Making matters worse is that the Americans in Massachusetts found themselves responsible for feeding the 6,000 or so prisoners of war that had been captured the year before in Saratoga. With the grain supply already distressingly low, the 6,000 or so Frenchmen climbing off of the ships in Boston Harbor were not exactly a welcome sight. Not that the average French soldier was all that much more excited to meet their new American allies. In one notable incident, the newly arrived French set up field ovens to bake bread in the harbor. When the hungry American sailors told the French that they had better have brought enough bread to share, the Frenchmen raised their eyebrows and then refused to share. Not amused by the rebuff, the American sailors attacked and very nearly killed the Chevalier de Saint-Sauveur on the spot. Adding to the headache is that Saint-Sauveur was not just any old soldier, but instead was the first chamberlain to the Court d'Artois, the brother of King Louis XVI. A few days after the incident took place, Saint-Sauveur died of his injuries. It was obviously not a great propaganda moment for the Americans when the first Frenchman to die in the United States was killed. Not by the British enemy, mind you, but rather from their American allies. Both the French and the Americans realized that this was a serious situation that could potentially threaten the alliance, something that neither side was terribly interested in doing. D'Estaing therefore decided that the best course of action was to lie. D'Estaing claimed that two groups of Britons, including some of the Saratoga prisoners, as well as captured Brits from merchant ships, started the fight that killed Saint-Sauveur. The Americans nodded along enthusiastically, agreeing that, yeah, it was the British that killed him. It definitely wasn't us. Bostonians, to further reinforce their deep sorrow over the Frenchman's death, promised that a monument was going to be built to honor Saint-Sauveur. You can see that monument today, marking Saint-Sauveur's grave at King's Chapel in Boston. Delivering the monument in a timely fashion, it was erected in 1917, mere weeks after the United States joined World War I. Although an outright international incident was avoided in the wake of the death of Saint-Sauveur, it was hardly the start to the alliance that anybody wanted. The Marquis de Lafayette had spent considerable energy during those summer months of 1778 at smoothing over the relationship between the French and the Americans. It likewise cannot be discounted that men like D'Estaing were willing to not only move on and forgive slights from men like Greene, but that he was effectively able to tune out more committed detractors like Sullivan. Even after the death of a man of status, like Saint-Sauveur, D'Estaing was willing to create a complete fiction in order to preserve the alliance. For Sullivan, the war was likewise not yet over. It is hard to deny that the Revolution had been nothing but a series of failures from him. From Canada to New York and now Newport, Sullivan just could not get a win. In short order, Sullivan would be dispatched on an expedition against the Indian tribes, an expedition that would prove to be shocking in its ruthlessness. The abortive Battle of Newport marked an important moment in the American Revolution, though likely none of the participants knew it. The battle would largely mark the end of the war for the northern states. Sure, the British were still ensconced in New York, with no plans of leaving anytime soon. However, the war is about to shift to the south. Although the Americans did not know it at the time, they were not going to see another campaign in the north. Next time, we are going to follow the British South as they would launch their southern strategy. The French arrival really did mean that the war had changed, and beginning next time, we will see just what that means. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as the British try their luck in the South.